Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the NOVA Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment, and also the National Law University in Kharkiv, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our participants and all of our speakers today for this webinar on business and human rights in times of war, the provision of essential goods and services. So as we know, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights affirm that because of the risk of gross human rights abuses is heightened in conflict-affected areas, states should help ensure that business enterprises that operate in those contexts are not involved in such abuses, and of course, business enterprises themselves are expected to conduct enhanced human rights due diligence. Within this, access to basic essential goods and services is particularly threatened in times of war. And that creates a challenging operating environment for businesses. Providers of such essential goods and services are faced with a difficult and complex dilemma, ensuring the safety of their employees on the one hand, or ensuring that the public needs are met through the provision of such essential goods and services on the other hand. Examples like the current situation in Ukraine shows that business responses actually vary greatly depending on the type of companies. In addition, ensuring access to essential goods and services can actually require different approaches from companies depending on the specific context. It's against that backdrop that today we have a stellar panel of speakers that will analyze the following questions with experiences from different regions. So we'll look at whether there is a universal or a context-specific understanding of what essential goods and services are, and whether that understanding could be impacted by a situation of war. They will also discuss how should the essentiality of goods and services be reflected in human rights assessment in situations of war. What are the role or the roles of public states actors in ensuring access to essential goods and services in times of war, and whether this role is an exclusively public function. They'll also explore the differences in conduct of providers of essential goods and services and how these differences could be explained and what leverage could be used to make it to foster responsible business conduct. And finally, they will also explore the tools that should be used to find a right balance between safety and employees on the one hand and meeting of the public needs on the other hand. So now I will introduce the speakers, and then I will pass the floor to them. So going in alphabetical order, starting from the last name, I will start with Noor Amadei, who is currently an independent consultant on business and human rights and corporate accountability in Syria. Previously, she was head of human rights and business unit at the Syrian Legal Development Program. And she also worked at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, where she explored issues related to business and human rights in the MENA region. She also worked as advocacy counsel at International Corporate Accountability Roundtable in Washington, where she is currently based. Next, we will have Sinisa Milatovic. He is an expert on business and human rights and is currently serving as a business and human rights specialist within UNDP. He is responsible for developing global programming and providing expertise on business and human rights to colleagues and partners in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, as well as Central Asia. Next, we have John Morrison, who has been the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Human Rights and Business since its formation in 2009. John leads the IHRB's global strategy, fundraising and outreach. And before joining the IHRB, John directed the Business Leaders Initiatives on Human Rights. He was also the head of public affairs for Body Shop, and also worked in the field of refugee protection before that. Last but not least, I would like to welcome Helena Uvarova, who is an associate professor and chair of the International Lab on Business and Human Rights at the National Law University of Kharkiv, where she teaches law. And she also leads the project and research support group at the National Law University, and she's currently a visiting researcher at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So welcome to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here today. And now, without further ado, I will pass the floor to Noor for a first round of intervention.
Thank you so much, Claire. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to be here with you all. So I'll actually be starting with the question around the role of public state actors in ensuring access to essential goods and services in times of war. And specifically, I'll address the question, is this role exclusively a public function? And I'll answer this question from the perspective of the Syrian context. So governments are typically, under normal circumstances, expected to provide essential goods and services to the public, or at the very least, help facilitate those services during times of conflict. And when there are fewer resources, when infrastructure is destroyed, it can be difficult for governments to be able to do this on their own. And so this is where private actors come in, or other non-state actors, such as NGOs, for example, humanitarian aid, and other governments as well, governments of other countries as well. That said, in some contexts, the government can't be relied upon to provide essential goods and services because the government itself is not only a party to the conflict, but the primary perpetrator of the conflict. And this is very much the case in the Syrian context, where you see that the Syrian government is very much the primary perpetrator in the conflict. A large portion of the destruction in Syria is due to the Syrian government and its allies, including Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure. There is evidence of a deliberate campaign intended to target hospitals and first responders. There have been sieges that have lasted years where the government has facilitated businesses' ability to take advantage of the siege conditions and the starvation that's resulted. One example is Muhyiddin Manfoush, who is a Syrian businessman who sold food and basic commodities in Damascus and was allowed to sell those in Ghouta when there was a siege there as well, and was allowed to hike up the price 20 times higher than the prices were in Damascus, knowing that there was no other food coming into those besieged towns. So in those circumstances, what's happening in Syria is that the government is not providing these services, it's not facilitating them, it's actually holding them back and preventing certain parts of the population from accessing essential goods and services. And as the authority in the position of power, the Syrian government is in control of this essential service provision. They're able to control where humanitarian aid goes, what humanitarian aid comes into the country. They are able to exploit their governmental obligations as an additional weapon of war against those that it perceives opposed to it. And that includes particularly populations within Syria who participated in national uprisings in 2011 and 2012. So there are three primary ways that the Syrian government sort of does this. The first is its ability to control money coming in on humanitarian aid, so humanitarian aid money coming into Syria. The second is its ability to control the aid provision itself and humanitarian aid agencies, as well as humanitarian NGOs coming into Syria. And then the third is its push for reconstruction in Syria. So regarding the first point, as the government authority in Syria that has the sort of sovereign figure in Syria, the Syrian regime has a large degree of control over, like I said, what humanitarian actors are allowed into Syria and what they're able to do. And so as a result, money coming into Syria is, money coming into Syria has to go through the Syrian Central Bank. And the Syrian Central Bank creates a sort of artificial exchange rate that that's completely different from sort of the exchange rate that the average person is using for currencies. And so as a result, the money that goes into the central bank loses nearly 50% of its value. So as a result of this, and a study by Natasha Hall at the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that up to 50%, 51 cents per US dollar of international aid that goes into Syria is lost to the Syrian central bank as a result of this exchange rate. And so when the money comes into Syria, it's required to go through the central bank, it's required to use their exchange rate, and as a result, over half of the money that's supposed to be going to civilians for essential goods and services like humanitarian aid provision is not going to individuals the way it's supposed to be. So the government's, so in this context, the government can't really be relied upon to provide these services because in its ability to provide those services, it's actually, or facilitate those services, it's actually taking them away. The Syrian government also uses sort of other parts of its role as the public body to facilitate sort of financing the war effort. So one example is that is passport provision. Passports, the Syrian passport, I believe, is now the most expensive passport in the world. It's also one of the least powerful, and depending on the country that an individual is going to get their passport in, and depending on if they want it expedited or not, it can range from $800 to $2,000 for a passport, and it needs to be renewed every 2 years. And for a lot of refugees in countries like Turkey, for example, that passport needs to be renewed every 2 years to ensure their ability to have status in the country. So this demonstrates how in some scenarios, exclusive reliance on the government for essential goods and services can actually be problematic. The second way that I want to discuss that the government is sort of taking advantage of its role in this way is its ability to control where aid goes within Syria. So humanitarian NGOs and particularly UN agencies are required when they are in Syria to work with two NGOs in particular. One is the Syria Trust for Development. The other is called Al-Bustan, Syria Trust for Development. And I will note that also part of it is that they don't really have much of a choice to work with other NGOs because the civil society space in Syria is so small, and really what is allowed to exist needs to be sort of sanctioned by the government to a certain extent. And so Syria Trust is an NGO that was founded and is run by Asma al-Akhras Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president's wife. And Al-Bustan was founded and funded and run by Rami Makhlouf, Bashar al-Assad's cousin, who has long been considered sort of the business arm of the Syrian government. At one point, he had control over up to 60% of the Syrian economy, so very powerful person in Syria. And he uses Al-Bustan not only for humanitarian aid provision, but also to finance, there's evidence that he also uses that money to finance his pro-government militias as well. So further contributing to the war effort. So what ends up happening is that humanitarian NGOs and UN humanitarian agencies who work with these NGOs are really limited with what they can do and where they can provide aid. The government is able to control what communities receive aid and which ones don't. And in addition to partnering with these NGOs, humanitarian agencies operating in Syria also contract with businesses there. And to a certain degree, this is also sort of tailored to what the Syrian government allows them to do. And as a result, what ends up happening is that many of the businesses that contract with UN agencies in Syria are owned by individuals who are subjected to sanctions in the US and the EU for their close ties to the Syrian government. And so even the private sector actors that are allowed to participate in the larger scale essential service and goods provision are ones that are sort of doing so as a way to make more money that sort of ends up also being funneled to the Syrian government. Many of these businesses are ones that either finance the Syrian government or its militias, or find ways to sort of publicly maintain the status quo that the Syrian government has created. The Syrian government and its allies have also contributed to preventing the UN Security Council from providing humanitarian access to parts of Syria outside of government control. So as the sovereign authority in the country, it's also preventing humanitarian aid from parts of the country that are controlled by parties that are opposed to it. So again, sort of using this as a weapon to punish civilians. Last, I want to talk about the Syrian government's role in reconstruction and rebuilding the country sort of post-conflict. This has been quite a controversial topic for a number of reasons. First, the Syrian government has been pushing for reconstruction, while others, and particularly activists, are arguing that the conflict is actually still ongoing. And the argument is that the Syrian government's push for reconstruction is an attempt to regain legitimacy. It's an attempt to say, look, the conflict is over, it's safe now, everything is good, tourists should start coming back, and we should regain our spot in the international scene, which is very much part of this a sort of trend toward normalization of the Syrian government's role in Syria that we're seeing. And the Syrian government's sort of plan for reconstruction is also an attempt to increase foreign investments into the country. It's also controversial because Syrian human rights activists and civil society have called out the Syrian, the reconstruction plan as not only inadequate, but also an attempt to further fill the pockets of government cronies while also keeping many Syrian civilians in a state of poverty. So the Syrian government's first reconstruction project, and I will say also other projects have sort of followed the same plan, the same structure. But the first project is something that they're calling Marota City. It envisions sort of a high-end city center with high rises and condos and shopping centers. And it'll be built over what's now called Basatin Razi. It's a small neighborhood in Damascus. And it's among the neighborhoods that were destroyed early on in the conflict because there were also many pro-democracy protests taking place there in 2011 and 2012. The plan has been to sort of evict people from their homes in Basatin Razi, destroy the buildings, and then rebuild Marota City over it. There is a plan in place for some residents to receive some form of compensation for their homes or to receive some form of alternative housing, but most people won't be able to access that because there are very specific rules around that, and those that do access that have found that the compensation is inadequate and won't allow them to be able to purchase new homes or find alternative housing themselves. So it's essentially another way that the government is using to further displace populations, move them away from the city center in Damascus, and sort of shift the population and the demographics in the area to demographics that are wealthier, are sort of pro-government, sort of government allies or people that support the government. The contracts for the construction of Marota City have all gone out to businesses owned by people who are closely aligned with the Syrian regime and have supported in financing its war efforts. So again, we're seeing sort of private sector involved in sort of essential service provision, but again, there's control over who can be involved in that. And then also that is sort of manipulated as a way to ensure that wealth is concentrated among certain people and among sort of those.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, sorry, please.
Oh, sorry, okay. So, and I'm almost done. But I think considering that this is the case, and well, one other point I want to make was just the Marota City project is the one that has moved the most forward. However, after the enactment of the Syria Civilian Protection Act in the US in 2019, which is a form of third-party sanctions, secondary sanctions imposed against individuals or entities involved in the Syrian government's reconstruction plan in Syria, among others. And so as a result, the Marota City project really had to stop and hasn't moved forward since then. And so that to a certain extent is a good thing, although there are also lots of negative repercussions to sanctions. So I just wanted to end quickly with a couple of recommendations. Considering that this is the case, there are ways in which non-government actors can support the provision of essential goods and services in Syria. One way to do this is through stronger human rights due diligence among humanitarian aid agencies and particularly UN agencies. Obviously, it's a very difficult context, and to a certain extent, they sort of have to play within the government's rules to be able to participate in humanitarian aid provision in Syria. That said, there are ways in which I think humanitarian agencies can work toward stronger human rights due diligence that, as much as possible, can help them to work with small and medium-sized businesses in Syria, or businesses that might be less closely aligned to the government, if that's possible. And to a certain extent, I know that the UN doesn't follow Western sanctions regimes, but maybe treat them as a warning to investigate certain businesses or certain individuals before working with them. And then I think lastly, sort of humanitarian aid provision, and as well as sanctions regimes, should be conducted from a human rights conscious manner. So especially when it comes to sanctions, small businesses and medium-sized businesses in Syria are incredibly impacted by them, and as a result really can struggle to continue to function. And so even in communities where there are businesses that could be supporting individuals, they're really struggling with that. And then lastly, the banks sort of also, I think that the biggest problem with sanctions also is just that banks treat that, instead of kind of conducting thorough human rights due diligence, instead just treat any Syrian business as off the market because of the risk of sanctions. And so banks taking a more nuanced approach would really help with the essential aid provision in Syria. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Noor, and well, I'll have the opportunity to come back to you. For now, I'd like to move on to our second speaker, Sinisha, for this first round of impression.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak to this panel. And it couldn't be timelier because actually UNDP is going to launch in 2 days our guide on heightened human rights due diligence that we've been developing for the past few months. So, you know, it's kind of a way for me to road test some of these assertions and ideas that we have in there. You mentioned a few sort of guiding questions at the beginning, and I'm not going to get necessarily into all of them, but I think there are some things that I could say to sort of help the discussion along. So one of the questions that you talked about was, you know, how should the essentiality of goods and services be reflected in human rights risk assessments in situations of war? I mean, I would posit, you know, one or two things. One, that it's actually not enough to conduct a human rights risk assessment in situations of war, that it's, you know, one half of the equation. But if this concept of heightened human rights due diligence is to have any meaning, the other part of it should be actually understanding the conflict, understanding the business's impact on the conflict, and basically carrying out a sort of conflict, through a conflict sensitive approach, carrying out a conflict analysis. So that's your other half of the equation. Now this, you know, obviously leads, you know, to lots of consequences, one of which is that human rights impact assessments may look at the essentiality of goods and services one way, but, you know, it may well be that a business impacts a conflict another way. It may well be that, you know, those impacts are countervailing and so on. You could impact human rights. You could have a duty even to stay to provide essential goods and services, but your presence or absence could further fuel conflict. So those are sort of parts of the equation that you need to take into account when thinking about all of this. Ultimately, it's about identifying your impact on people and their rights, as well as on the context, which is, you know, conflict and its dynamics. And I think in that sense, you know, when we talk about differences of conduct of providers of essential goods and services and so on, I don't necessarily think that, you know, the definition of essential goods and services doesn't necessarily change in war. I mean, you could define it however you want, but, you know, you have the pyramid of needs of Amartya Sen or whatever, you know, ranging from water, water, food, shelter, and so on. It's more about, you know, do businesses have any extra obligations? And I think, as a matter of fact, they do, you know, and that's where we come back to context. the context is ever shifting, which is why it's important to carry out this sort of conflict analysis, because it may well be that governments as the primary parties responsible for, protecting human rights and for fulfilling these essential needs and providing these essential services, it may well be that they're able to provide them at one point and then they aren't. It may well be that, they are able to do that in, a certain part of a conflict affected area and they aren't in another. So it's down to the business to, even though this isn't sort of staking new ground for the business and, it's effectively requiring new skills of them, it's down to the business to essentially carry out a conflict analysis, to keep it updated, to see, how the conflict is impacting the provision of essential goods and services, but also to see what its, engagement or lack thereof could mean for the conflict as well as for these human rights. For the enjoyment of human rights. So I think it's a sort of, the answer in and of itself isn't necessarily all that clear. It's more in the process rather than in the outcome. And the process requires businesses to add a bit of knowledge about, conflict dynamics, where they're operating, what the context is, in addition to, let's say, if we presume their knowledge already on human rights impact assessments and so on, and how they're impacting human rights. I'll stop there because I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'll be glad to come back to all of this later on, but back to you for now, Claire.
Thank you so much, Sinisha, and we're going to go to John now.
Thanks, Claire, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll be quick, and I think Helena has some very important things to say from the Ukrainian perspective. I'll try and build on what we've just heard. Clearly, the UN guiding principles and enhanced human rights due diligence is where you start. But I think what the UNGPs don't answer is the question I think you posed right at the beginning as to what are essential services. The UNGPs will tell you what perhaps are the most important salient human rights and who are the most vulnerable populations, and how those two things should come together and how businesses should respect rights in those contexts. But we're often talking about a position of humanitarian need and dire consequence. And so the UNGPs are the starting place, but I don't think in the context of conflict they're sufficient to really understand. So I'll just in like 3-4 minutes try and think about, would it be possible for us to get beyond the Groundhog Day of trying to find these benchmarks around essential services as we did previously on Iran, Sudan, Cuba? We'll go back. There's all these different, Northern Ireland, been involved in many of these discussions. Now, I did agree with that last point that in a way, there's a conversation around essential services that's going on anyway, outside of the context of conflict. And, around the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, a lot of the work of the special rapporteurs on health, education, housing, now water, now healthy environment. Many of them have looked at the role of business and what businesses should and shouldn't do, and many of them have developed principles around what businesses should do in relation to what they see as public goods or essential services. There's also work that's been done on the internet, and some countries actually recognize the right to the internet as a human right in its own right. I'd love all of that work to come into play a lot more when we talk about conflict, but it hasn't done so far. But I'll flag just 4 areas where we can look, right? So clearly, the first is the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions and others relating to conflict areas and occupied territories. This is hugely relevant to Ukraine at the moment. So that then begins to flag issues like land, water, food, but also ownership rights, medical issues. And business is often involved in the supply chain of those issues, if not the delivery itself. So I think that would be the first place, the Geneva Conventions. The second is actually US sanction regimes themselves have developed carve-outs on humanitarian need. If you look at Iran, for example, Iraq, Venezuela, some of those based on healthcare, some of them agricultural machinery, etc. So I think the OFAC work over the past 20, 30 years, given the US has probably been the most rigorous government in relation to sanctions, is worth looking at too. The third place I look is the European Convention on Human Rights. Ukraine is a member of the Council of Europe. Russia was until recently. It looks like the UK is also questioning its membership. But let's say what the European Convention does, it does distinguish between businesses that perform state-like duties, right, in the provision of security or in prisons or in healthcare, and de facto that those businesses have more than a respect duty. They actually have a duty to, you could argue, a full state duty in relation to the provision of those rights. So I think when we think about Ukraine specifically, because it's in the Council of Europe area, the European Convention and the case law of the European Convention is another place. And then the final place I would look is some of the investor coalitions, brand-led initiatives, etc., that have been built up around Sudan after Darfur, or Uzbekistan around cotton, etc. Many of them have carve-outs too. There was a carve-out in Sudan around telecommunication companies in Sudan, for example. Ericsson got that carve-out. So I think, again, there's sort of, we've developed an understanding of essentiality there as well. I'd love to see us bring all of that together, as well as some of the thinking that goes on in between conflict times. And I'll end on a very controversial point. If these services are essential, and we're talking about broader populations who are not directly involved in the conflict, we're talking about Russians as well as Ukrainians when we talk about universal benchmarks. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. And now to Helena.
Yeah, hello everybody. And yes, when we are talking about essential goods and services, of course, we are talking about context-specific understanding of social goods and services. And again, this understanding could be changed even within one crisis, even within one conflict, and even at the same time for different zones, for different territories of the same country affected by conflict, by the war. The understanding of essentiality could be different and could be changed. And in Ukraine, we conducted a short survey and asked people from different territories affected by active military actions, territory which are temporarily occupied, and territory which is calm. We asked people about the understanding of essentiality of goods and services at this moment, and actually the most essential services for many of them are internet and communication services. It has the first play of essentiality for many people, and this water, drinking water delivery, this electricity and gas supply, this bank services, medicine services, public transport, and even garbage collection. These services were mentioned as essential during Ukrainian conflict and the war in Ukraine. But unfortunately, and I agree with Nova that there is a growing tendency to use essential resources and infrastructure as targets of attacks and means of warfare and military actions in Ukraine caused by Russian military forces. Clearly confirm this trend, but at the same time, crisis caused by the war does not change the fundamentals of human rights, and of course, the situation changes our understanding of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And I could say that, of course, the situation could mean extra responsibility for providers of essential goods and services. For example, these pictures show different situations in different places in Ukraine. These lines at the very beginning of the war, lines in Kharkiv of people who were trying to buy some products, some drinking waters, and some of these lines were attacked, and people died in these lines. Some of these pictures are about these days. For example, the picture it's center picture shows the situation in Mariupol. In today's people are still without drinking waters during already 4 months without drinking waters. The right picture shows the situation in occupied Melitopol. It's south on the southern part of Ukraine, because occupational authorities just stopped any opportunity to use internet and communication. People just are trying to find any opportunity to communicate with their relatives, and they don't have even opportunity for call emergency or something like that. So the situation in different parts are different, and of course people depend on responsible business conduct. And if we are talking about heightened human rights due diligence, companies which are providers of essential services and goods, from my understanding, should ask themselves first of all, are they suppliers or providers of essential goods and services based on this context-specific approach? And do they continue to supply, to provide essential goods and services after the start of war, after the start of crisis, after the start of occupation of the territory? If yes, if they continue to operate, they need to ask themselves, have you assessed the risk to safety of employees, and what should be done to minimize such risks? Access to bomb shelters, provide them with helmets and body armor, increase security, and so on. Because, for example, municipality-owned companies continue to operate during all period of the war in Ukraine, but the safety of employees are under huge question, because these employees are working just under shellings and so on. Have you assessed additional gender-based risks, in particular the increased risk of gender-based violence, especially on the temporarily occupied territories or territories near to the military actions? Have you assessed how the needs of the local population for access to essential goods and services have changed? Because again, the state could be able to provide itself access to essential goods and services. Humanitarian aid could be provided. Civil society organizations play a huge role. Volunteers play a huge role. So essentiality of goods and services doesn't mean that this concrete company are essential providers of such goods and services. So the general situation should be assessed as well. And how the market of the provision of such goods and services and the role of this concrete company in this market changed or not changed. Does this company interact with government agencies to understand the situation, municipal authorities, civil society organizations, volunteers to coordinate efforts to ensure access to essential goods and services? John said, and I can repeat that vulnerabilities of individual groups and concrete individuals should be taken into consideration. And in our chat, Rebecca asked about good examples. I can provide several good examples, but for example, taxi service, Ukrainian local company Uklon, which is a taxi service very similar to Uber, continued to operate even in very dangerous environment, just because decision makers, CEO of these local companies, remain in Ukraine, and they understand very well the local context, and they understand that their company plays a very important role to evacuate local people, because any other transport didn't work at that moment, and it was only one option to be evacuated to use this service. Not a good example. Uber stopped to operate at the very beginning of the conflict in all territory of Ukraine, just because the reason was safety of the employees. But I believe that if they asked employees prefer to continue to work. And as I said before, we have very different situations in different parts of Ukraine. And if a company stopped to provide essential services and goods, a company should ask itself several questions as well. And actually, first of all, it should explain the reason of stopping of providing essential services and goods. It could be high risk to the safety of employees, but again, this reason should be assessed itself as well, because it could be not enough just to refer to safety of employees, and safety of employees could be ensured by provided additional steps to ensure such safety and to balance safety and the need to have access to essential services and goods. Unwilling to cooperate with occupying authorities, it's very hard, very complicated question, because the official position of Ukrainian government is that all businesses, without taking into consideration access to essential services and goods, all businesses should stop to operate in the territory which is occupied. So the reasons which companies take as reason to stop to provide essential services and goods would be different, but it could be just a reference to these reasons. Every reason should be assessed additionally. Is actually this reason legitimate or not? And in both options, in both scenarios, the question about local context and involvement of volunteers, of civil society organizations, of the local populations, of employees should be taken into consideration. It's very, very brief and my understanding of the situation.
Thank you, Helena. And as Sinisha informed us that there was a power cut in his whole neighborhood, so unfortunately his internet got cut off. He'll try to rejoin, but we're not certain. Anyway, so for now, I see there is a question already in the Q&A, so I wanted to address that question perhaps to John first, and then we can see if other panelists would like to also share some examples. Obviously, Helena has just given some of basically positive examples of companies doing the right thing in a situation of conflict. More specifically, has there been any company proactively taking action to protect and respect human rights in such situations, or do they tend to wait for governments to legislate? John, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, often they can't wait for governments to legislate because the thing is happening in real time at their front gate. So there are many, many stories of how businesses have responded with either governmental troops or other armed combatants demanding services, demanding protection money. The voluntary principles on security and human rights in some ways were developed because of this reality. So there are many, many cases of businesses doing, I would say, the right thing, which is putting the security of their own people and staff first, but also local populations under their protection, but also understanding the role of civilian authorities under the Geneva Conventions and ensuring they're not complicit. And doing the wrong thing, I guess we're all familiar with the Lafarge-Holstein criminal case in France, where allegedly Lafarge was complicit in war crimes committed by ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. So I guess that's a pretty public example of doing the wrong thing, right?
Thank you, John. And maybe, yes, Helena, I see.
Yeah, some other positive examples from Ukraine. For example, Ukrainian mobile companies cooperate with each other to provide national roaming. It means that if users of one company could not, because of technical issues, could not use the services of one company, it should just use services of other mobile company, just change on their mobile app, just change the company without any additional payments, and so on and so forth. And actually it was, in many cases, it was crucial, especially again on occupied territories, because on occupied territories there are a lot of technical issues, and some mobile operators could not operate, but others can, and that's why this option was really very important for residents on temporarily occupied territories.
Thank you very much, Helena. And Noor, I wonder if you had also examples to share.
Yeah, I don't think I have any examples from the Syrian context in particular, because I think in terms of businesses in Syria, a lot of them are very much bound by, like I said, sanctions regimes, but then also sort of working around Syrian government systems. But I think a couple examples I can give from outside of Syria in sort of the Middle East is one example. In Lebanon is, I think a lot of businesses following the civil war took a really large role in sort of corporate social responsibility initiatives. So not necessarily business and human rights, not necessarily human rights due diligence, but sort of using their role to contribute to post-conflict peace building and rebuilding, and finding ways that they can very actively participate in sort of rebuilding following the conflict and supporting local communities and very much being part of the community. Another example, and this is sort of a very different context, is in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict context. I think one example of companies sort of doing the right thing is companies divesting from participating in sort of business that exploits occupied Palestinian territories that are occupied illegally under international law. And I know that this is quite controversial, maybe just in the US, I'm not sure, but something that I think is a really strong example of businesses sort of not waiting for their governments to legislate and really taking steps to do the right thing there.
Thank you very much, Nora. And now for the second round of interventions, I thought maybe we'll start in reverse order, with this time starting from Helena and then John and then Nora, to see if you had any things you wanted to respond to the others' interventions, or some elements you wanted to add to your previous intervention. So Helena.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, actually, my point is that if business model is based on providing essential services and goods in peaceful time, of course, it means that company is ready to go to take on itself some public function, because as we said previously, of course, providing essential services and goods in classic model, this is responsibility, this is a duty of the state. But if company is going to take itself this function, public function, it means that company takes itself the part of duty to protect, duty to fulfill, duty to promote, which is in classical understanding is state duty. But maybe we even need to re-understanding of this concept of state duty and corporate responsibility. Maybe not state and not state, maybe it depends on the role of the concrete actors to provide access to concrete human rights. So if this actor plays a role of public actor, even partly, we should consider this actor as public actor, and that's why I'm talking about this extra responsibility, as Sinisha said previously, extra responsibility of corporate actors, which providers of essential services and goods.
Thank you, Helena. John?
Yeah, to build on that, I totally agree with Helena's point there. And there's a lack of global consensus about this. So the UNGPs really didn't deal with the issue. And I think we were talking about it 15, 20 years ago about the role of business in public goods and essential services. Around, like, I remember when the right to water became a human right 10, 12 years ago, in some countries like Malaysia or the UK, right, it's all privatized, right, the provision of water, yet the essential duty still sits with the government. But the day-to-day reality of realizing that right sits in private hands. And I don't think we've traveled a long way in greater understanding. And I keep coming back to the European Convention on Human Rights because it has dealt with this issue, right? And it's highly relevant. The problem with the European Convention on Human Rights is it just looks at civil and political rights. So it doesn't help us with the questions of land, water, and food, and some of these, other essential services. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. My other reflection, and I guess it's my role to be a little bit controversial on the panel, is, Helena and I have spoken about this before, is, there are two essential services discussions happening around the current Ukrainian conflict. There is the Ukrainian element of it, where you have the occupied territories, the conflict areas, and the non-conflict areas. And essentially, what's expected of business is different in each of those three contexts. But there's the other essential services discussion around Russia and sanctions that's going on in parallel. And there, some businesses are justifying remaining in Russia because of their connection to the provision of essential services. Whilst in the Ukrainian context, and as Helena has said very lucidly already, there are essential services not being delivered by private actors because of the fear of conflict. So it's a sad reality, but we have these two parallel conversations that aren't really joining up much. And I do think, now is time for us to have that sort of deeper, more forensic discussion about what the role of private actors is in the delivery of essential services and human rights. in peacetime, but also in conflict. It just feels like an agenda item that really hasn't shifted much in 15 years. And each time we have a crisis, we have the discussion again. And I hope that maybe we can maintain this conversation and deepen it, and with some urgency, because it does relate, of course, to the ongoing situation in Ukraine, and you know, the fear that private actors might have of even being in the country, and then the more difficult and ongoing question about Russia and divestment and responsible exits, or in some cases companies remaining there, and what the expectations on them should be. But I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Noor?
Yeah, I think building off of John's point, I think one thing that I'm very much noticing now and is becoming very clear just within this conversation and listening to Helena speak about the situation in Ukraine is that conflict is not doesn't look the same in every country. And as a result, the role of business in each conflict situation is going to be very different. And so I would just leave the audience with that point, which is that there's not one universal role for businesses in the context of conflict. And John just made that clear with the distinction between the role for businesses in Russia versus in Ukraine, and then the different contexts within Ukraine. So I think, as John said, this is just these questions and this the question of what role businesses should play needs to come with a lot of nuance and being conscious of all the different dynamics that are at play in each context.
I think that's a very important point, and perhaps on a finishing note, I wonder if and that's a question to all of the speakers, what could we learn from each of his experience, the experience of the different conflicts, as you pointed out, Noor and John, that are quite different for improving the situation of business and human rights in situation of conflict in the future?
I don't know who you're asking. Is that a question or a final reflection? Claire.
I mean, question, but
I'll just give it we're maintaining our center in Myanmar, where we have 15 members of staff, and it's been there for 10 years. It's a very difficult operating in Myanmar, operating environment, and many people think we should have closed the center this year. But we ask ourselves this question every morning in Yangon, right? And I think this unfortunately is going to be an issue in many operating environments in different places. And you've got 400,000 women in the apparel sector in Burma who, if the brands left, would be, you know, smuggled and trafficked to Malaysia to work in the apparel sector. So the issue of human rights impacts on civilians is a complex issue, and this is heightened due diligence must take on board what the impacts of remaining would be, but also what the impact of exiting would be. And Telenor, of course, has been highly criticized for the way it's left Myanmar. So it is, you know, whether you stay or you go, you have to do it with your eyes open and understand the impacts that that's likely to have. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Elena, final remarks?
I think my feeling is that the huge challenge is to rapid assessment, assessment the local context, and as we see in Ukraine, as I said before, if decision makers are local and they understand this local context, decisions were much more responsible in many cases than when it's just much easier, worse for many companies just to stop operations, and it's the easiest decision in many cases. So, and this is the first point. And the second point, it's obvious, but I say it again, that human rights thinking should be built before the crisis. That's all.
Thank you so much, Helena. And I see Sinisha managed to rejoin, so maybe I could address the question to Sinisha for a last intervention. We had a question, Sinisha, from Rebecca and Guillen on positive examples of companies doing the right thing in situation of conflict. And so I don't know if you have any examples to share or any advice in that respect.
So wait, my power goes out. I walk around half an hour to find a new power outlet. Then you ask me for positive examples of companies. I mean, I wish my power had stayed off, you know. What positive examples? I'm joking. There must be some
negative examples as well, if you prefer.
No, I'm sure there are loads, but my time is running. No, I'm joking. I mean, I can tell, you know, there are companies who've, how do I put it, who've taken steps towards taking steps, you know, but I personally am not that aware, you know, and we have companies which have approached us now with the launch of this guide saying, yes, we need this. But I mean, you know, one of the reasons it's needed is because the idea of heightened human rights due diligence is not all that clear, and it's not all that clear to companies what they should be doing. So, you know, and to be fair, it's a bit complex. So, you know, without meaning to sort of weasel out of an answer of a concrete company, you know, I wouldn't necessarily, but I think maybe in a year's time when we reconvene, that there will be, let's say. So I'll
Thank you, Sinisha. And do you have some final remarks before we close? Anything you wanted to add, perhaps, to your previous?
No, I'm really sorry to miss, you know, unfortunately, the half of the discussion. I mean, I would encourage all of you to register for our event. It would be great. And as I said, maybe in a year's time we can reconvene and talk about the state of play in the field, because there might be a field in a year's time, you know, let's say heightened human rights due diligence and so on and so on. So thanks again for convening this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinisha. Thank you to all our panelists today for taking the time and for your very insightful interventions. We at the NOVA Center for Business, Human Rights and the Environment also have a project on business in conflict-affected areas that is led by my colleague Laura Alvarez, who's here on the panel as well. Laura recently prepared a practical brief for the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce that she will share on the chat if that is of interest. And thank you also to the audience for attending the event today. The recording will be available on the NOVA website within the next few days. And thank you to our very dear partners from Kharkiv for helping organize the event, and to Helena in particular. Thank you very much and have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.